change, of course, has been drastic and dramatic. The military is unrecognizable since the start of the war. It has transformed from the remnant of a post-Soviet army, underfunded, under-resourced, into an effective fighting force, while, of course, fighting a war at the same time. It's been a dramatic transformation. Now, the problem with that is that some of the elements that might have been in place if it had been a more slow and methodical process of reform have not been realized in quite the same way as perhaps they should have been. This is the roots of some of the criticisms of reform so far, that it has not gone far enough in terms of westernizing the military according to some concepts like civilian control, transparency, and so on. Nevertheless, we shouldn't underestimate just how far the Ukrainian armed forces and all of their ancillary forces have come in a very short time.
So what would it mean in practice for Ukraine's army to reach Western standards? What would have to happen there?
Well, there are two distinct challenges here. The first is actually taking all of the best from Western experience and applying it. And that means in terms of command and control, flexibility, the jointness of operations between forces. But there is also an image problem that has to be addressed, and that is the fact that Ukraine is occasionally perceived as having armed forces which are inefficient because they are not under centralized control, and also served by a defense industry which is rife with corruption. There are immediate problems with that. If either of those are actually true, then obviously it hampers the fighting efficiency of the armed forces, but also in terms of the image that Russia projects to the West and the United States in particular, there are distinct disadvantages to this problem. For instance, in a very immediate sense, some U.S. aid is conditional on defense reform and on pushing through some of the changes that have been promised but not yet delivered. But overall, there's the enormous problem of convincing the United States and the West as a whole that Ukraine is actually worth defending and worth siding with. And corruption allegations in particular, when they are persistent and apparently unresolved, pose a significant challenge to that.
Two of the areas that are often mentioned in terms of problems in reforming the military are volunteer battalions and also defense procurement. Could you tell us a bit more about those issues?
Well, in the volunteer battalions issue in particular, there is a problem of perception lagging behind reality. The negative image of the volunteer battalions in the very early stages of the conflict, when they were an emergency measure to respond to Russian aggression, has persisted long after a lot of the problems that were associated with them, like the lack of direct control, the potential use as private armies, the independence from the armed forces effort as a whole. Those problems have largely passed and been resolved, but the negative impression has taken more time to dispel among critics of the Ukrainian war effort. And in defense procurement in particular, Ukроборонпром is portrayed as something which is impenetrable and not transparent, and actually a mechanism which is permissive for corruption. There are consistent allegations that defense procurement is based on not only enriching the people involved in it, but also providing to the armed forces those pieces of equipment which the industry is actually in a position to produce, as opposed to the ones that it actually needs. So another impediment to long-standing reform.
So you mentioned the image problem here. How can Ukrainian society, or for that matter, Ukraine's Western partners, how can they measure whether the military is moving in the right direction? What would the signs be for them?
Well, fortunately, the West does have a window into exactly what is happening in Ukrainian defense reform because, of course, all of the training missions that are actually working directly with the Ukrainian armed forces. That's sometimes seen as the West imparting knowledge to Ukraine, but of course it is a two-way process. It's a window into what is going on, and also the West learns about what is happening in terms of Russian military developments through that feedback loop being passed back through the Ukrainian armed forces. However, in other areas, and in particular, once again, defense procurement, there are criticisms that there is a lack of transparency, not only to those Western agencies that are seeking to cooperate with Ukraine, but also those that would like to assist it in terms of funding, but find that it's impossible to do so because there is a lack of visibility on exactly how funds would be used and how these agencies operate.
So given these issues, how can Ukraine's Western partners play a constructive role in this reform process going forward?
Well, we have seen just over the last few years a lot more conditionality starting to be attached to the assistance that is being given. Not in the direct military sense, as far as we're aware. There doesn't seem to be any challenge to the ongoing training missions. But as I mentioned earlier, the United States, for example, has made part of its aid package dependent on some essential reforms being pushed through. I suspect that in the near to medium term, we will see more of those conditions being applied unless Ukraine does actually address its image problem and demonstrate that it is taking significant steps to resolve the defense procurement side in particular.
One final question. We've seen Ukraine has experienced some rather severe defeats in Ilovaisk in 2014 and Debaltseve in 2015. Is the Ukrainian army today efficient, generally speaking, or does it have a long way to go?
Well, let's place those defeats in context. This was at a very early stage of Ukraine responding to aggression and trying to work out exactly how it could optimize its armed forces in a crash program for resisting as best it could. We shouldn't see any performance of any military that is operating under those conditions as representative of what would happen once you can take a longer term and more considered approach to reforming it. In other words, we shouldn't judge the potential performance of the Ukrainian armed forces now by anything that happened even just a short time ago, like Ilovaisk and Debaltseve. So, as I mentioned at the very start, yes, enormous progress has been made in a very short time. There is still a way to go, but it's a very different armed force to the one we saw at the outbreak of the conflict.